The Crowd, a Study of the Popular Mind by Gustave Le Bon. Book 3. The Classification and Description of the Different Kinds of Crowds. Chapter 1. The Classification of Crowds. We have sketched in this work the general characteristics common to psychological crowds. It remains to point out the particular characteristics which accompany those of a general order in the different categories of collectivities when they are transformed into a crowd under the influences of the proper exciting causes. We will, first of all, set forth in a few words a classification of crowds. Our starting point will be the simple multitude. Its most inferior form is met with when the multitude is composed of individuals belonging to different races. In this case, its only common bond of union is the will, more or less respected of a chief. The barbarians of very diverse origin, who during several centuries invaded the Roman Empire, may be cited as a specimen of multitudes of this kind. On a higher level than these multitudes, composed of different races, are those which under certain influences have acquired common characteristics and have ended by forming a single race. They present at times characteristics peculiar to crowds, but these characteristics are overruled to a greater or less extent by racial considerations. These two kinds of multitudes may, under certain influences investigated in this work, be transformed into organized or psychological crowds. We shall break up these organized crowds into the following divisions. A. Heterogeneous crowds. 1. Anonymous crowds. Street crowds, for example. 2. Crowds not anonymous. Juries, Parliamentary, Assemblies, etc. B. Homogeneous crowds. 1. Sex, political sects, religious sects, etc. 2. Caste, the military caste, the priestly caste, the working caste, etc. 3. Classes, the middle classes, the peasant classes, etc. We will point out briefly the distinguishing characteristics of these different categories of crowds. 1. Heterogeneous crowds. It is these collectivities whose characteristics have been studied in this volume. They are composed of individuals of any description, of any profession, and any degree of intelligence. We are now aware that by the mere fact that men form part of a crowd engaged in action, their collective psychology differs essentially from their individual psychology, and their intelligence is affected by this differentiation. We have seen that intelligence is without influence in collectivities, they being solely under the sway of unconscious sentiments. A fundamental factor, that of race, allows of a tolerably thorough differentiation of the various heterogeneous crowds. We have often referred already to the part played by race, and have shown it to be the most powerful of the factors capable of determining men's actions. Its action is also to be traced in the character of crowds. A crowd composed of individuals assembled at haphazard, but all of them Englishmen or Chinamen, will differ widely from another crowd also composed of individuals of any and every description, but of other races, Russians, Frenchmen, or Spaniards, for example. The wide divergencies which their inherited mental constitution creates and men's modes of feeling and thinking at once come into prominence when, which rarely happens, circumstances gather together in the same crowd and in fairly equal proportions individuals of different nationality, and this occurs, however identical in appearance be the interest which provoked the gathering. The efforts made by the socialists to assemble in great congresses the representatives of the working class populations of different countries have always ended in the most pronounced discord. A Latin crowd, however revolutionary or however conservative it be supposed, will invariably appeal to the intervention of the state to realize its demands. It is always distinguished by a marked tendency toward centralization and by a leaning, more or less pronounced, in favor of a dictatorship. An English or an American crowd, on the contrary, sets no store on the state and only appeals to private initiative. A French crowd lays particular weight on equality and an English crowd on liberty. These differences of race explain how it is that there are almost as many different forms of socialism and democracy as there are nations. The genius of the race, then, exerts a paramount influence upon the dispositions of a crowd. It is the powerful underlying force that limits its changes of humor. It should be considered as an essential law that the inferior characteristics of crowds are the less accentuated in proportion as the spirit of the race is strong. The crowd state and the domination of crowds is equivalent to the barbarian state or to a return to it. It is by the acquisition of a solidly constituted collective spirit that the race frees itself to a greater and greater extent from the unreflecting power of crowds, and emerges from the barbarian state. The only important classification to be made of heterogeneous crowds, apart from that based on racial considerations, is to separate them into anonymous crowds, such as street crowds, and crowds not anonymous, deliberative assemblies and juries, for example. The sentiment of responsibility, absent from crowds of the first description and developed in those of the second, often gives a very different tendency to their respective acts. 2. Homogeneous crowds. Homogeneous crowds include 1. Sects, 2. Castes, 3. Classes. The sect represents the first step in the process of organization of homogeneous crowds. A sect includes individuals differing greatly as to their education, their professions, and the class of society to which they belong, and with their common beliefs as the connecting link. Examples in point are religious and political sects. The caste represents the highest degree of organization of which the crowd is susceptible, while the sect includes individuals of very different professions, degrees of education, and social surrounding who are only linked together by the beliefs they hold in common. The caste is composed of individuals of the same profession, and in consequence, similarly educated and of much the same social status. Examples in point are the military and priestly caste. The class is formed of individuals of diverse origin, linked together not by a community of beliefs, as are the members of a sect, or by common professional occupations, as are the members of a caste, but by certain interests and certain habits of life and education almost identical. The middle class and the agricultural class are examples. Being only concerned in this work with heterogeneous crowds and reserving the study of homogeneous crowds, sects, castes, and classes for another volume, I shall not insist here on the characteristics of crowds of this latter kind. I shall conclude this study of heterogeneous crowds by the examination of a few typical and distinct category of crowds. Chapter 2. Crowds termed criminal crowds. Owing to the fact that crowds, after a period of excitement, enter upon a purely automatic and unconscious state in which they are guided by suggestion, it seems difficult to qualify them in any case as criminal. I only retain this erroneous qualification because it has been definitely brought into vogue by recent psychological investigations. Certain acts of crowds are assuredly criminal, if considered merely in themselves, but criminal in that case in the same way as the act of a tiger devouring a Hindu after allowing its young to maul him for their amusement. The usual motive of the crimes of crowds is a powerful suggestion, and the individuals who take part in such crimes are afterwards convinced that they have acted in obedience to duty, which is far from being the case with the ordinary criminal. The history of the crimes committed by crowds illustrates what precedes. The murder of M. de Launay, the governor of the Bastille, may be cited as a typical example. After the taking of the fortress, the governor, surrounded by a very excited crowd, was dealt blows from every direction. It was proposed to hang him, to cut off his head, to tie him to a horse's tail. While struggling, he accidentally kicked one of those present. Someone proposed, and his suggestion was at once received with acclamation by the crowd, that the individual who had been kicked should cut the governor's throat. The individual in question, a cook out of work, whose chief reason for being at the Bastille was idle curiosity as to what was going on, esteems that since such is the general opinion, the action is patriotic, and even believes he deserves a medal for having destroyed a monster. With a sword that is lent him, he strikes the bare neck, but the weapon being somewhat blunt and not cutting, he takes from his pocket a small black-handled knife, and, in his capacity of cook, he would be experienced in cutting up meat, successfully effects the operation. The working of the process indicated above is clearly seen in this example. We have obedience to a suggestion, which is all the stronger because of its collective origin, and the murderer's conviction that he has committed a very meritorious act, a conviction the more natural, seeing that he enjoys the unanimous approval of his fellow citizens. An act of this kind may be considered crime legally, but not psychologically. The general characteristics of criminal crowds are precisely the same as those we have met with in all crowds. Openness to suggestion, credulity, mobility, the exaggeration of the sentiments, good or bad, the manifestation of certain forms of morality, etc. We shall find all these characteristics present in a crowd which has left behind it in French history the most sinister memories, the crowd which perpetrated the September massacres. In point of fact, it offers much similarity with the crowd that committed the St. Bartholomew massacres. I borrow the details from the narration of M. Taine, who took them from contemporary sources. It is not known exactly who gave the order or made the suggestion to empty the prisons by massacring the prisoners. Whether it was Danton, as is probable, or another does not matter. The one interesting fact for us is the powerful suggestion received by the crowd charged with the massacre. The crowd of murderers numbered some 300 persons and was a perfectly typical heterogeneous crowd. With the exception of a very small number of professional scoundrels, it was composed in the main of shopkeepers and artisans of every trade, bootmakers, locksmiths, hairdressers, masons, clerks, messengers, etc. Under the influence of the suggestion received, they are perfectly convinced, as was the cook referred to above, that they are accomplishing a patriotic duty. They fill a double office, being at once judge and executioner, but they do not for a moment regard themselves as criminals. Deeply conscious of the importance of their duty, they begin by forming a sort of tribunal, and in connection with this act, the ingenuousness of crowds and their rudimentary conception of justice are seen immediately. In consideration of the large number of the accused, it is decided that, to begin with, the nobles, priests, officers, and members of the king's household, in a word, all the individuals whose mere profession is proof of their guilt in the eyes of a good patriot, shall be slaughtered in a body, there being no need for a special decision in their case. The remainder shall be judged on their personal appearance and their reputation. In this way, the rudimentary conscience of the crowd is satisfied. It will now be able to proceed legally with the massacre, and to give free scope to those instincts of ferocity whose genesis I have set forth elsewhere, they being instincts which collectivities always have it in them to develop to a high degree. These instincts, however, as is regularly the case in crowds, will not prevent the manifestation of other and contrary sentiments, such as a tender-heartedness, often as extreme as the ferocity. They have the expansive sympathy and prompt sensibility of the Parisian working man. At the Abbaye, one of the federates, learning that the prisoners had been left without water for 26 hours, was bent on putting the gaoler to death, and would have done so but for the prayers of the prisoners themselves. When a prisoner is acquitted by the improvised tribunal, everyone, guards and slaughterers included, embraces him with transports of joy and applauds frantically. After which the wholesale massacre is recommenced. During its progress, a pleasant gaiety never ceases to reign. There is dancing and singing around the corpses, and benches are arranged for the ladies, delighted to witness the killing of aristocrats. The exhibition continues, moreover, of a special description of justice. A slaughterer at the Abbaye, having complained that the ladies placed at a little distance saw badly, and that only a few of those present had the pleasure of striking the aristocrats, the justice of the observation is admitted, and it is decided that the victims shall be made to pass slowly between two rows of slaughterers, who shall be under the obligation to strike with the back of the sword, only so as to prolong the agony. At the prison de la Force, the victims are stripped stark naked and literally carved for half an hour, after which, when every one has had a good view, they are finished off by a blow that lays bare their entrails. The slaughterers, too, have their scruples and exhibit that moral sense whose existence in crowds we have already pointed out. They refuse to appropriate the money and jewels of the victims, taking them to the table of the committees. Those rudimentary forms of reasoning, characteristic of the mind of crowds, are always to be traced in all their acts. Thus, after the slaughter of the 1,200 or 1,500 enemies of the nation, someone makes the remark, and his suggestion is at once adopted, that the other prisons, those containing aged beggars, vagabonds, and young prisoners, hold in reality useless mouths, of which it would be well on that account to get rid. Besides, among them there should certainly be enemies of the people, A woman of the name of Delarue, for instance, the widow of a poisoner. She must be furious at being in prison. If she could, she would set fire to Paris. She must have said so. She had said so. Another good riddance. The demonstration appears convincing, and the prisoners are massacred without exception, included in the number being some 50 children of from 12 to 17 years of age, who of course might themselves have become enemies of the nation, and of whom in consequence it was clearly well to be read. At the end of a week's work, all these operations being brought to an end, the slaughterers can think of reposing themselves, profoundly convinced that they have deserved well of their country. They went to the authorities and demanded a recompense. The most zealous went so far as to claim a medal. The history of the Commune of 1871 affords several facts analogous to those which precede. Given the growing influence of crowds and the successive capitulations before them of those in authority, we are destined to witness many others of a like nature. Chapter 3. Criminal Juries. Being unable to study here every category of jury, I shall only examine the most important, that of the juries of the Court of Assizes. These juries afford an excellent example of the heterogeneous crowd that is not anonymous. We shall find them display suggestibility and but slight capacity for reasoning. While they are open to the influence of the leaders of crowds, and they are guided in the main by unconscious sentiments, in the course of this investigation, we shall have occasion to observe some interesting examples of the errors that may be made by persons not versed in the psychology of crowds. Juries, in the first place, furnish us a good example of the slight importance of the mental level of the different elements composing a crowd, so far as the decisions it comes to are concerned. We have seen that when a deliberative assembly is called upon to give its opinion on a question of a character not entirely technical, intelligence stands for nothing. For instance, a gathering of scientific men or of artists, owing to the mere fact that they form an assemblage, will not deliver judgments on general subjects sensibly different from those rendered by a gathering of masons or grocers. At various periods, and in particular previous to 1848, the French administration instituted a careful choice among the persons summoned to form a jury, picking the jurors from among the enlightened classes, choosing professors, functionaries, men of letters, etc. At the present day, jurors are recruited, for the most part, from among small tradesmen, petty capitalists, and employees. Yet, to the great astonishment of specialist writers, whatever the composition of the jury has been, its decisions have been identical. Even the magistrates, hostile as they are to the institution of the jury, have had to recognize the exactness of the assertion. M. Bérard de Glajeux, a former president of the Court of Assizes, expresses himself on the subject in his memoirs in the following terms. The selection of jurymen is today in reality in the hands of the municipal councillors, who put people down on the list or eliminate them from it in accordance with the political and electoral preoccupations inherent in their situation. The majority of those jurors chosen are persons engaged in trade, but persons of less importance than formerly, and employees belonging to certain branches of the administration. Both opinions and professions counting for nothing, once the role of judge assumed. Many of the jurymen, having the ardor of neophytes, and men of the best intentions, being similarly disposed in humble situations, the spirit of the jury has not changed. Its verdicts have remained the same. Of the passage just cited, the conclusions which are just are to be borne in mind, and not the explanations which are weak. Too much astonishment should not be felt at this weakness, for, as a rule, counsel equally with magistrates seem to be ignorant of the psychology of crowds, and, in consequence, of juries. I find a proof of this statement in a fact related by the author just quoted. He remarks that Lachard, one of the most illustrious barristers practicing in the court of Assisi, made systematic use of his right to object to a juror in the case of all individuals of intelligence on the list. Yet experience, and experience alone, has ended by acquainting us with the utter usefulness of these objections. This is provided by the fact that at the present day public prosecutors and barristers, at any rate those belonging to the Parisian bar, have entirely renounced their right to object to a juror. Still, as M. de Glajot remarks, the verdicts have not changed. They are neither better nor worse. Like all crowds, juries are very strongly impressed by sentimental considerations, and very slightly by arguments. They cannot resist the sight, writes a barrister, of a mother giving its child a breast, or of orphans. It is sufficient that a woman should be of agreeable appearance, says M. de Glajot, to win the benevolence of the jury. Without pity for crimes of which it appears possible they might themselves be the victims. Such crimes, moreover, are the most dangerous for society. Juries, on the contrary, are very indulgent in the case of breaches of the law whose motive is passion. They are rarely severe on infanticide by girl mothers, or hard on the young woman who throws vitriol at the man who has seduced and deserted her, for the reason that they feel instinctively that society runs but slight danger from such crimes, and that in a country in which the law does not protect deserted girls, the crime of the girl who avenges herself is rather useful than harmful, inasmuch as it frightens future seducers in advance. Juries, like all crowds, are profoundly impressed by prestige, and President de Glajot very properly remarks that, very democratic as juries are in their composition, they are very aristocratic in their likes and dislikes. Name, birth, great wealth, celebrity, the assistance of an illustrious counsel, everything in the nature of distinction, or that lends brilliancy to the accused, stands him in extremely good stead. The chief concern of a good counsel should be to work upon the feelings of the jury, and, as with all crowds, to argue but little, or only to employ rudimentary modes of reasoning. An English barrister, famous for his success in the assize courts, have well set forth the line of action to be followed. While pleading, he would attentively observe the jury. The most favorable opportunity has been reached. By dint of insight and experience, the counsel reads the effect of each phrase on the faces of the jurymen, and draws his conclusions in consequence. His first step is to be sure which members of the jury are already favorable to his cause. It is short work to definitely gain their adhesion. In having done so, he turns his attention to the members who seem, on the contrary, ill-disposed, and endeavors to discover why they are hostile to the accused. This is the delicate part of his task, for there may be an infinity of reasons for condemning a man apart from the sentiment of justice. These few lines resume the entire mechanism of the art of oratory, and we see why the speech prepared in advance has so slight an effect, it being necessary to be able to modify the terms employed from moment to moment in accordance with the impression produced. The orator does not require to convert to his views all the members of a jury, but only the leading spirits among it, who will determine the general opinion. As in all crowds, so in juries there are a small number of individuals who serve as guides to the rest. I have found by experience, says the counsel cited above, that one or two energetic men suffice to carry the rest of the jury with them. It is those two or three whom it is necessary to convince by skillful suggestions. First of all, and above all, it is necessary to please them. The man forming part of a crowd, whom one has succeeded in pleasing, is on the point of being convinced, and is quite disposed to accept as excellent any arguments that may be offered him. I detach the following anecdote from an interesting account of M. Lachard, alluded to above. It is well known that during all the speeches he would deliver in the course of an assize sessions, Lachard never lost sight of the 2 or 3 jurymen whom he knew or felt to be influential but obstinate. As a rule, he was successful in winning over these refractory jurors. On one occasion, however, in the provinces, he had to deal with a juryman whom he plied in vain for 3/4 of an hour with his most cunning arguments. The man was the 7th juryman, the first on the second bench. The case was desperate. Suddenly, in the middle of a passionate demonstration, Lachard stopped short, and addressing the president of the court said, "Would you give instructions for the curtain there in front to be drawn? The 7th juryman is blinded by the sun." The juryman in question reddened, smiled, and expressed his thanks. He was won over for the defense. Many writers, some of them most distinguished, have started of late a strong campaign against the institution of the jury, although it is the only protection we have against the errors, really very frequent, of a caste that is under no control. A portion of these writers advocate a jury recruited slowly from the ranks of the enlightened classes, but we have already proved that even in this case, the verdicts would be identical with those returned under the present system. Other writers, taking their stand on the errors committed by juries, would abolish the jury and replace it by judges. It is difficult to see how these would-be reformers can forget that the errors for which the jury is blamed were committed in the first instance by judges, and that when the accused person comes before a jury, he has already been held to be guilty by several magistrates, by the juge d'instruction, the public prosecutor, and the court of arraignment. It should thus be clear that were the accused to be definitely judged by magistrates instead of by jurymen, he would lose his only chance of being admitted innocent. The errors of juries have always been, first of all, the errors of magistrates. It is solely the magistrates, then, who should be blamed when particularly monstrous judicial errors crop up, such, for instance, as the quite recent condemnation of Dr. L., who, prosecuted by a juge d'instruction of excessive stupidity on the strength of the denunciation of a half-idiot girl who accused the doctor of having performed an illegal operation upon her for 30 francs, would have been sent to penal servitude but for an explosion of public indignation, which had for result that he was immediately set at liberty by the chief of the state. The honorable character given the condemned man by all his fellow citizens made the grossness of the blunder self-evident. The magistrates themselves admitted it, and yet out of a caste consideration they did all they could to prevent the pardon being signed. In all similar affairs, the jury, confronted with technical details it is unable to understand, naturally hearkens to the public prosecutor, arguing that, after all, the affair has been investigated by magistrates trained to unravel the most intricate situations. Who then are the real authors of the error? The jurymen or the magistrates? We should cling vigorously to the jury. It constitutes perhaps the only category of crowd that cannot be replaced by any individuality. It alone can temper the severity of the law, which, equal for all, ought in principle to be blind and to take no cognizance of particular cases. Inaccessible to pity, and heeding nothing but the text of the law, the judge in his professional severity will visit with the same penalty the burglar guilty of murder and the wretched girl whom poverty and her abandonment by her seducer have driven to infanticide. The jury, on the other hand, instinctively feels that the seduced girl is much less guilty than the seducer, who, however, is not touched by the law, and that she deserves every indulgence. Being well acquainted with the psychology of caste, and also with the psychology of other categories of crowds, I do not perceive a single case in which, wrongly accused of a crime, I should not prefer to have to deal with a jury rather than with magistrates. I should have some chance that my innocence would be recognized by the former, and not the slightest chance that it would be admitted by the latter. The power of crowds is to be dreaded, but the power of certain castes is to be dreaded yet more. Crowds are open to conviction. Castes never are. Chapter 4. Electoral crowds. Electoral crowds, that is to say, collectivities invested with the power of electing the holders of certain functions, constitute heterogeneous crowds, but as their action is confined to a single, clearly determined matter, namely, to choosing between different candidates, they present only a few of the characteristics previously described. Of the characteristics peculiar to crowds, they display in particular but slight aptitude for reasoning, the absence of the critical spirit, irritability, credulity, and simplicity. In their decision, moreover, is to be traced the influence of the leaders of crowds and the part played by the factors we have enumerated: affirmation, repetition, prestige, and contagion. Let us examine by what methods electoral crowds are to be persuaded. It will be easy to deduce their psychology from the methods that are most useful. It is of primary importance that the candidate should possess prestige. Personal prestige can only be replaced by that resulting from wealth. Talent and even genius are not elements of success of serious importance. Of capital importance, on the other hand, is the necessity for the candidate of possessing prestige, of being able, that is, to force himself upon the electorate without discussion. The reason why the electors, of whom a majority are working men or peasants, so rarely choose a man from their own ranks to represent them, is that such a person enjoys no prestige among them. When by chance they do elect a man who is their equal, it is as a rule for subsidiary reasons, for instance, to spite an eminent man, or an influential employer of labor on whom the elector is in daily dependence, and whose master he has the illusion he becomes in this way for a moment. The possession of prestige does not suffice, however, to assure the success of a candidate. The elector stickles in particular for the flattery of his greed and vanity. He must be overwhelmed with the most extravagant blandishments, and there must be no hesitation in making him the most fantastic promises. If he is a working man, it is impossible to go too far in insulting and stigmatizing employers of labor. As for the rival candidate, an effort must be made to destroy his chance by establishing, by dint of affirmation, repetition, and contagion, that he is an arrogant scoundrel, and that it is a matter of common knowledge that he has been guilty of several crimes. It is, of course, useless to trouble about any semblance of proof. Should the adversary be ill acquainted with the psychology of crowds, he will try to justify himself by arguments instead of confining himself to replying to one set of affirmations by another, and he will have no chance whatever of being successful. The candidate's written program should not be too categorical, since later his adversaries might bring it up against him. In his verbal program, however, there cannot be too much exaggeration. The most important reforms may be fearlessly promised. At the moment they are made, these exaggerations produce a great effect, and they are not binding for the future, it being a matter of constant observation that the elector never troubles himself to know how far the candidate he has returned has followed out the electoral program he applauded, and in virtue of which the election was supposed to have been secured. In what precedes, all the factors of persuasion which we have described are to be recognized. We shall come across them again in the action exerted by words and formulas, whose magical sway we have already insisted upon. An orator who knows how to make use of these means of persuasion can do what he will with a crowd. Expressions such as infamous capital, vile exploiters, the admirable working man, the socialization of wealth, etc., always produce the same effect, although already somewhat worn by use. But the candidate who hits on a new formula, as devoid as possible of precise meaning, and apt in consequence to flatter the most varied aspirations, infallibly obtains a success. The sanguinary Spanish Revolution of 1873 was brought about by one of these magical phrases of complex meaning on which everybody can put his own interpretation. A contemporary writer has described the launching of this phrase in terms that deserve to be quoted. The radicals have made the discovery that a centralized republic is a monarchy in disguise, and to humor them, the Cortes had unanimously proclaimed a federal republic, though none of the voters could have explained what it was he had just voted for. This formula, however, delighted everybody. The joy was intoxicating, delirious. The reign of virtue and happiness had just been inaugurated on earth. A Republican whose opponent refused him the title of Federalist considered himself to be mortally insulted. People addressed each other in the streets with the words, "Long live the Federal Republic," after which the phrases were sung of the mystic virtue of the absence of discipline in the army and of the autonomy of the soldiers. What was understood by the Federal Republic? There were those who took it to mean the emancipation of the provinces, institutions akin to those of the United States, and administrative decentralization. Others had in view the abolition of all authority and the speedy commencement of the great social liquidation. The socialists of Barcelona and Andalusia stood out for the absolute sovereignty of the communes. They proposed to endow Spain with 10,000 independent municipalities to legislate on their own account, and their creation to be accompanied by the suppression of the police and the army. In the southern provinces, the insurrection was soon seen to spread from town to town and village to village. Directly a village had made its pronunciamento, its first care was to destroy the telegraph wires and the railway lines so as to cut off all communication with its neighbors and Madrid. The sorriest hamlet was determined to stand on its own bottom. Federation had given place to cantonalism, marked by massacres, incendiarism, and every description of brutality and bloody saturnalia was celebrated throughout the length and breadth of the land. With respect to the influence that may be exerted by reasoning on the minds of electors, to harbor the least doubt on this subject can only be the result of never having read the reports of an electioneering meeting. In such a gathering, affirmations, invectives, and sometimes blows are exchanged, but never arguments. Should silence be established for a moment, it is because someone present, having the reputation of a tough customer, has announced that he is about to heckle the candidate by putting him one of those embarrassing questions which are always the joy of the audience. The satisfaction, however, of the opposition party is short-lived, for the voice of the questioner is soon drowned in the uproar made by his adversaries. The following reports of public meetings, chosen from hundreds of similar examples and taken from the daily papers, may be considered as typical. One of the organizers of the meeting, having asked the Assembly to elect a president, the storm burst. The anarchists leap onto the platform to take the committee table by storm. The socialists make an energetic defense. Blows are exchanged, and each party accuses the other of being spies in the pay of the government. A citizen leaves the hall with a black eye. The committee is at length installed, as best it may be in the midst of the tumult, and the right to speak devolves upon Comrade X. The orator starts a vigorous attack on the socialists, who interrupt him with shouts of idiot, scoundrel, blackguard, epithets, to which Comrade X replies by setting forth a theory according to which the socialists are idiots or jokers. The Almanist Party had organized yesterday evening in the Hall of Commerce, in the Rue du Faubourg du Temple, a great meeting preliminary to the workers' fête of the 1st of May. The watchword of the meeting was calm and tranquility. Comrade G alludes to the socialists as idiots and humbugs. At these words, there is an exchange of invectives, and orators and audience come to blows. Chairs, tables, and benches are converted into weapons. It is not to be imagined for a moment that this description of discussion is peculiar to a determined class of electors and dependent on their social position. In every anonymous assembly whatever, though it be composed exclusively of high, educated persons, discussion always assumes the same shape. I have shown that when men are collected in a crowd, there is a tendency towards their mental leveling at work, and proof of this is to be found at every turn. Take, for example, the following extract from a report of a meeting composed exclusively of students, which I borrow from the temps of 13th of February, 1895. The tumult only increased as the evening went on. I do not believe that a single orator succeeded in uttering 2 sentences without being interrupted. At every instant there came shouts from this or that direction, or from every direction at once. Applause was intermingled with hissing. Violent discussions were in progress between individual members of the audience. Sticks were brandished threateningly. Others beat a tattoo on the floor. And the interrupters were greeted with yells of "put him out" or "let him speak." MC lavished such epithets as odious and cowardly, monstrous, vile, venal, and vindictive on the association, which he declared he wanted to destroy. How, it may be asked, can an elector form an opinion under such conditions? To put such a question is to harbor a strange delusion as to the measure of liberty that may be enjoyed by collectivity. Crowds have opinions that have been imposed upon them, but they never boast reasoned opinions. In the case under consideration, the opinions and votes of the electors are in the hands of the election committees, whose leading spirits are, as a rule, publicans, their influence over the working men, to whom they allow credit, being great. Do you know what an election committee is? Writes M. Scherer, one of the most valiant champions of present-day democracy. It is neither more nor less than the cornerstone of our institutions, the masterpiece of the political machine. France is governed today by the election committees. To exert an influence over them is not difficult, provided the candidate be in himself acceptable and possess adequate financial resources. According to the admissions of the donors, 3 millions of francs sufficed to secure the repeated elections of General Boulanger. Such is the psychology of crowds. It is identical with that of other crowds, neither better nor worse. In consequence, I draw no conclusion against universal suffrage from what precedes. Had I to settle its fate, I should preserve it as it is for practical reasons, which are to be deduced in point of fact from our investigation of the psychology of crowds. On this account, I shall proceed to set them forth. No doubt, the weak side of universal suffrage is too obvious to be overlooked. It cannot be gainsaid that civilization has been the work of a small minority of superior intelligences, constituting the culminating point of a pyramid, whose stages, widening in proportion to the decrease of mental power, represent the masses of a nation. The greatness of a civilization cannot assuredly depend upon the votes given by inferior elements boasting solely numerical strength. Doubtless, too, the votes recorded by crowds are often very dangerous. They have already cost us several invasions, and in view of the triumph of socialism, for which they are preparing the way, it is probable that the vagaries of popular sovereignty will cost us still more dearly. Excellent, however, as these objections are in theory, in practice they lose all force, as will be admitted if the invincible strength be remembered of ideas transformed into dogmas. The dogma of the sovereignty of crowds is as little defensible from the philosophical point of view as the religious dogmas of the Middle Ages. But it enjoys at present the same absolute power they formerly enjoyed. It is as unattackable in consequence as in the past were our religious ideas. Imagine a modern freethinker miraculously transported into the midst of the Middle Ages. Do you suppose that after having ascertained the sovereign power of the religious ideas that were then in force, he would have been tempted to attack them? Having fallen into the hands of a judge disposed to send him to the stake, under the imputation of having concluded a pact with the devil, or of having been present at witches' Sabbath, would it have occurred to him to call in question the existence of the devil or of the Sabbath? It were as wise to oppose cyclones with discussion as the beliefs of crowds. The dogma of universal suffrage possesses today the power the Christian dogmas formerly possessed. Orators and writers allude to it with a respect and adulation that never fell to the share of Louis XIV. In consequence, the same position must be taken up with regard to it, as with regard to all religious dogmas. Time alone can act upon them. Besides, it would be the more useless to attempt to undermine this dogma, inasmuch as it has an appearance of reasonableness in its favor. In an era of equality, Tocqueville justly remarks, men have no faith in each other on account of their being all alike. Yet this same similitude gives them an almost limitless confidence in the judgment of the public, the reason being that it does not appear probable that, all men being equally enlightened, truth and numerical superiority should not go hand in hand. Must it be believed that with a restricted suffrage, a suffrage restricted to those intellectually capable if it be desired, an improvement would be effected in the votes of crowds? I cannot admit for a moment that this would be the case, and that for the reasons I have already given touching the mental inferiority of all collectivities, whatever their composition. In a crowd, men always tend to the same level, and on general questions, a vote recorded by 40 academicians is no better than that of 40 water carriers. I do not in the least believe that any of the votes for which universal suffrage is blamed, the re-establishment of the empire, for instance, would have fallen out differently had the voters been exclusively recruited among learned and liberally educated men. It does not follow because an individual knows Greek or mathematics, is an architect, a veterinary surgeon, a doctor, or a barrister, that he is endowed with a special intelligence of social questions. All our political economists are highly educated, being for the most part professors or academicians. Yet, is there a single general question, protection, bimetallism, etc., on which they have succeeded in agreeing? The explanation is that their science is only a very attenuated form of our universal ignorance. With regard to social problems, owing to the number of unknown quantities they offer, men are substantially equally ignorant. In consequence, were the electorate solely composed of persons stuffed with the sciences, their votes would be no better than those emitted at present. They would be guided in the main by their sentiments and by party spirit. We should be spared none of the difficulties we now have to contend with, and we should certainly be subjected to the oppressive tyranny of caste. Whether the suffrage of crowds be restricted or general, whether it be exercised under a republic or monarchy, in France, in Belgium, in Greece, in Portugal, or in Spain, it is everywhere identical, and when all is said and done, it is the expression of the unconscious aspirations and needs of the race. In each country, the average opinions of those elected represent the genius of the race, and they will be found not to alter sensibly from one generation to another. It is seen then that we are confronted once more by the fundamental notion of race, which we have come across so often, and on this other notion, which is the outcome of the first, that institutions and governments play but a small part in the life of a people. Peoples are guided in the main by the genius of their race, that is, by that inherited residue of qualities of which the genius is the sum total. Race and the slavery of our daily necessities are the mysterious master causes that rule our destiny. Chapter 5. Parliamentary Assemblies. In parliamentary assemblies, we have an example of heterogeneous crowds that are not anonymous. Although the mode of election of their members varies from epoch to epoch, and from nation to nation, they present very similar characteristics. In this case, the influence of the race makes itself felt to weaken or exaggerate the characteristics common to crowds, but not to prevent their manifestation. The parliamentary assemblies of the most widely different countries of Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain, France, and America present great analogies in their debates and votes, and leave the respective governments face to face with their identical difficulties. Moreover, the parliamentary system represents the ideal of all modern civilized peoples. The system is the expression of the idea, psychologically erroneous but generally admitted, that a large gathering of men is much more capable than a small number of coming to a wise and independent decision on a given subject. The general characteristics of crowds are to be met with in parliamentary assemblies: intellectual simplicity, irritability, suggestibility, the exaggeration of the sentiments, and the preponderating influence of a few leaders. In consequence, however, of their special composition, parliamentary crowds offer some distinctive features which we shall point out shortly. Simplicity in their opinions is one of their most important characteristics. In the case of all parties, and more especially so far as the Latin peoples are concerned, an invariable tendency is met within crowds of this kind to solve the most complicated social problems by the simplest abstract principles and general laws applicable to all cases. Naturally, the principles vary with the party, but owing to the mere fact that the individual members are a part of a crowd, they are always inclined to exaggerate the worth of their principles and to push them to their extreme consequences. In consequence, parliaments are more especially representative of extreme opinions. The most perfect example of the ingenuous simplification of opinions peculiar to assemblies is offered by the Jacobins of the French Revolution. Dogmatic and logical to a man, and their brains full of vague generalities, they busied themselves with the application of fixed principles without concerning themselves with events. It has been said of them, with reason, that they went through the revolution without witnessing it. With the aid of the very simple dogmas that served them as guide, they imagined they could recast society from top to bottom and cause a highly refined civilization to return to a very anterior phase of the social evolution. The methods they resorted to realize their dream wore the same stamp of absolute ingenuousness. They confined themselves in reality to destroying what stood in their way. All of them, moreover, Girondists, the men of the mountain, the Thermidorians, were alike animated by the same spirit. Parliamentary crowds are very open to suggestion, and as in the case of all crowds, the suggestion comes from leaders possessing prestige. But the suggestibility of parliamentary assemblies has very clearly defined limits, which it is important to point out. On all questions of local or regional interest, every member of an assembly has fixed, unalterable opinions, which no amount of argument can shake. The talent of a Demosthenes would be powerless to change the vote of a deputy on such questions as protection or the privilege of a distilling alcohol. Questions in which the interest of influential electors are involved. The suggestion emanating from these electors and undergone before the time to vote arrives sufficiently outweighs suggestions from any other source to annul them and to maintain an absolute fixity of opinion. On general questions, the overthrow of a cabinet, the imposition of a tax, there is no longer any fixity of opinion, and the suggestions of leaders can exert an influence, though not in quite the same way as in an ordinary crowd. Every party has its leaders, who possess occasionally an equal influence. The result is that the deputy finds himself placed between two contrary suggestions, and is inevitably made to hesitate. This explains how it is that he is often seen to vote in contrary fashion in an interval of a quarter of an hour, or to add to a law an article which nullifies it. For instance, to withdraw from employers of labor the right of choosing and dismissing their workmen, and then to very nearly annul this measure by an amendment. It is for the same reason that every chamber that is returned has some very stable opinions, and other opinions that are very shifting. On the whole, the general questions being the more numerous, indecision is predominant in the chamber. The indecision which results from the ever-present fear of the elector, the suggestion received from whom is always latent, and tends to counterbalance the influence of the leaders. Still, it is the leaders who are definitely the masters in those numerous discussions, with regard to the subject matter of which the members of an assembly are without strong preconceived opinions. The necessity for these leaders is evident, since, under the name of heads of groups, they are met with in the assemblies of every country. They are the real rulers of an assembly. Men forming a crowd cannot do without a master, whence it results that the votes of an assembly only represent, as a rule, the opinions of a small minority. The influence of the leaders is due in very small measure to the arguments they employ, but in a large degree to their prestige. The best proof of this is that, should they by any circumstance lose their prestige, their influence disappears. The prestige of these political leaders is individual and independent of name or celebrity, a fact of which M. Jules Simon gives us some very curious examples in his remarks on the prominent men of the Assembly of 1848, of which he was a member. 2 months before he was all-powerful, Louis Napoleon was entirely without least importance. Victor Hugo mounted the tribune. He failed to achieve success. He was listened to as Felix Pyat was listened to, but he did not obtain as much applause. "I don't like his ideas," Val Labelle said to me, speaking of Felix Pyat. "But he is one of the greatest writers and the greatest orator of France." Edgar Quinet, in spite of his exceptional and powerful intelligence, was held in no esteem whatever. He had been popular for a while before the opening of the assembly. In the assembly he had no popularity. The splendor of genius makes itself less felt in political assemblies than anywhere else. They only give heed to eloquence appropriate to the time and place, and to party services, not to services rendered the country. For homage to be rendered Lamartine in 1848 and Thiers in 1871, the stimulant was needed of urgent and inexorable interest. As soon as the danger was past, the parliamentary world forgot in the same instant its gratitude and its fright. I have quoted the preceding passage for the sake of the facts it contains, not of the explanations it offers, their psychology being somewhat poor. A crowd at once would lose its character of a crowd were to credit its leaders with their services, whether of a party nature or rendered their country. The crowd that obeys a leader is under the influence of his prestige, and its submission is not dictated by any sentiment of interest or gratitude. In consequence, the leader endowed with sufficient prestige wields almost absolute power. The immense influence exerted during a long series of years, thanks to his prestige, by a celebrated deputy, beaten at the last general election in consequence of certain financial events, is well known. He had only to give the signal, and cabinets were overthrown. A writer has clearly indicated the scope of his action in the following lines. It is due, in the main, to MX that we paid 3 times as dearly as we should have done for Tonkin, that we remained so long on a precarious footing in Madagascar, that we were defrauded of an empire in the region of the lower Niger, and that we have lost the preponderating situation we used to occupy in Egypt. The theories of MX have cost us more territories than the disasters of Napoleon I. We must not harbor too bitter a grudge against the leader in question. It is plain that he has cost us very dear, but a great part of his influence was due to the fact that he followed public opinion, which in colonial matters was far from being at that time what it has since become. A leader is seldom in advance of public opinion. Almost always all he does is to follow it and to espouse all its errors. The means of persuasion of the leaders we are dealing with, apart from their prestige, consist in the factors we have already enumerated several times. To make a skillful use of these resources, a leader must have arrived at a comprehension, at least in an unconscious manner, of the psychology of crowds, and must know how to address them. He should be aware in particular of the fascinating influence of words, phrases, and images. He should possess a special description of eloquence, composed of energetic affirmations unburdened with proofs, and impressive images, accompanied by very summary arguments. This is a kind of eloquence that is met with in all assemblies, the English Parliament included. The most serious, though, it is of all. Debates in the House of Commons, says the English philosopher Maine, may be constantly read in which the entire discussion is confined to an exchange of rather weak generalities and rather violent personalities. General formulas of this description exercise a prodigious influence on the imagination of a pure democracy. It would always be easy to make a crowd accept general assertions presented in striking terms, although they have never been verified and are perhaps not susceptible of verification. Too much importance cannot be attached to the striking terms alluded to in the above quotation. We have already insisted on several occasions on the special power of words and formulas. They must be chosen in such a way as to evoke very vivid images. The following phrase, taken from a speech by one of the leaders of our assemblies, affords an excellent example. When the same vessel shall bear away to the fever-haunted lands of our penitentiary settlements, the politician of shady reputation and the anarchist guilty of murder, the pair will be able to converse together, and they will appear to each other as the two complementary aspects of one and the same state of society. The image thus evoked is very vivid, and all the adversaries of the speaker felt themselves threatened by it. They conjured up a double vision of the fever-haunted country and the vessel that may carry them away. For is it not possible that they are included in the somewhat ill-defined category of the politicians menaced? They experienced the lurking fear that the man of the convention must have felt, whom the vague speeches of Robespierre threatened with the guillotine, and who, under the influence of this fear, invariably yielded to him. It is all to the interest of the leaders to indulge in the most improbable exaggerations. The speaker of whom I have just cited a sentence was able to affirm, without arousing violent protestations, that bankers and priests had subsidized the throwers of bombs, and that the directors of the great financial companies deserved the same punishment as anarchists. Affirmations of this kind are always effective with crowds. The affirmation is never too violent, the declamation never too threatening. Nothing intimidates the audience more than this sort of eloquence. Those present are afraid that if they protest, they will be put down as traitors or accomplices. As I have said, this peculiar style of eloquence has ever been of sovereign effect in all assemblies. In times of crisis, its power is still further accentuated. The speeches of the great orators of the assemblies of the French Revolution are very interesting reading from this point of view. At every instant they thought themselves obliged to pause in order to denounce crime and exalt virtue, after which they would burst forth into imprecations against tyrants and swear to live free men or perish. Those present rose to their feet, applauded furiously, and then, calmed, took their seats again. On occasion, the leader may be intelligent and highly educated, but the possession of these qualities does him, as a rule, more harm than good. By showing how complex things are, by allowing of explanation and promoting comprehension, intelligence always renders its owner indulgent, and blunts in a large measure that intensity and violence of conviction needful for apostles. The great leaders of all crowds of all ages, and those of the Revolution in particular, have been of lamentably narrow intellect, while it is precisely those whose intelligence has been the most restricted who have exercised the greatest influence. The speeches of the most celebrated of them, of Robespierre, frequently astound one by their incoherence. By merely reading them, no plausible explanation is to be found of the great part played by the powerful dictator. The commonplaces and redundancies of pedagogic eloquence and Latin culture, at the service of a mind childish rather than undistinguished, and limited in its notions of attack and defense to the defiant attitude of schoolboys. Not an idea, not a happy turn of phrase or a telling hit. A storm of declamation that leaves us bored. After a dose of this unexhilarating reading, one is tempted to exclaim, "Oh," with the amiable Camille Desmoulins. It is terrible at times to think of the power that strong conviction combined with extreme narrowness of mind gives a man possessing prestige. It is nonetheless necessary that these conditions should be satisfied for a man to ignore obstacles and display strength of will in a high measure. Crowds instinctively recognize in men of energy and conviction the masters they are always in need of. In a parliamentary assembly, the success of a speech depends almost solely on the prestige possessed by the speaker, and not at all on the arguments he brings forward. The best proof of this is that when, for one cause or another, a speaker loses his prestige, he loses simultaneously all his influence, that is, his power of influencing votes at will. When an unknown speaker comes forward with a speech containing good arguments, but only arguments, the chances are that he will obtain a hearing. A deputy who is a psychologist of insight, M. de Sorbes, has recently traced in the following lines the portrait of the deputy who lacks prestige. When he takes his place in the tribune, he draws a document from his portfolio, spreads it out methodically before him, and makes his start with assurance. He flatters himself that he will implant in the minds of his audience the conviction by which he himself is animated. He has weighed and reweighed his arguments. He is well primed with figures and proofs. He is certain he will convince his hearers. In the face of the evidence, he is to adduce all resistance would be futile. He begins confident in the justice of his cause, and relying upon the attention of his colleagues, whose only anxiety, of course, is to subscribe to the truth. He speaks, and is at once surprised at the restlessness of the House, and a little annoyed by the noise that is being made. How is it silence is not kept? Why this general inattention? What are those deputies thinking about who are engaged in conversation? What urgent motive has induced this or that deputy to quit his seat? An expression of uneasiness crosses his face. He frowns and stops. Encouraged by the president, he begins again, raising his voice. He is only listened to all the less. He lends emphasis to his words and gesticulates. The noise around him increases. He can no longer hear himself, and again stops. Finally, afraid that his silence may provoke the dreaded cry, "The closure!" he starts off again. The clamor becomes unbearable. When parliamentary assemblies reach a certain pitch of excitement, they become identical with ordinary heterogeneous crowds, and their sentiments in consequence present the peculiarity of being always extreme. They will be seen to commit acts of the greatest heroism or the worst excesses. The individual is no longer himself, and so entirely is this the case that he will vote measures most adverse to his political interests. The history of the French Revolution shows to what an extent assemblies are capable of losing their self-consciousness and of obeying suggestions most contrary to their interests. It was an enormous sacrifice for the nobility to renounce its privileges, yet it did so without hesitation on a famous night during the sittings of the Constituent Assembly. By renouncing their inviolability, the men of the convention placed themselves under a perpetual menace of death, and yet they took this step and were not afraid to decimate their own ranks, though perfectly aware that the scaffold to which they were sending their colleagues today might be their own fate tomorrow. The truth is, they had attained to that completely automatic state which I have described elsewhere, and no consideration would hinder them from yielding to the suggestions by which they were hypnotized. The following passage from the memoirs of one of them, Bayard Varennes, is absolutely typical on this score. The decisions with which we have been so reproached, he says, were not desired by us 2 days, a single day before they were taken. It was the crisis and nothing else that gave rise to them. Nothing can be more accurate. The same phenomena of unconsciousness were to be witnessed during all the stormy sittings of the convention. They approved and decreed measures, says Taine, which they held in horror. Measures which were not only stupid and foolish, but measures that were crimes. The murder of innocent men, the murder of their friends. The left, supported by the right, unanimously and amid loud applause, sent to the scaffold Danton, its natural chief, and the great promoter and leader of the revolution. Unanimously and amid the greatest applause, the right, supported by the left, votes the worst decrees of the revolutionary government. Unanimously and amid cries of admiration and enthusiasm, amid demonstrations of passionate sympathy for Collot d'Herbois, Couthon, and Robespierre, the convention, by spontaneous and repeated re-elections, keeps in office the homicidal government, which the plain detests because it is homicidal, and the mountain detests because it is decimated by it. The plain and the mountain, the majority and the minority, finish by consenting to help on their own suicide. The 22 Prairial, the entire convention offered itself to the executioner. The 8 Thermidor, during the first quarter of an hour that followed Robespierre's speech, it did the same thing again. This picture may appear somber, yet it is accurate. Parliamentary assemblies, sufficiently excited and hypnotized, offer the same characteristics. They become an unstable flock, obedient to every impulsion. The following description of the Assembly of 1848 is due to M. Spuler, a parliamentarian whose faith in democracy is above suspicion. I reproduce it from the Revue Littéraire, and it is thoroughly typical. It offers an example of all the exaggerated sentiments which I have described as characteristic of crowds, and of that excessive changeableness which permits of assemblies passing, from moment to moment, from one set of sentiments to another, entirely opposite. The Republican Party was brought to its perdition by its divisions, its jealousies, its suspicions, and in turn its blind confidence and its limitless hopes. Its ingenuousness and candor were only equaled by its universal mistrust. An absence of all sense of legality, of all comprehension of discipline, together with boundless terrors and illusions. The peasant and the child are on a level in these respects. Their calm is as great as their impatience. Their ferocity is equal to their docility. This condition is the natural consequence of a temperament that is not formed and of the lack of education. Nothing astonishes such persons, and everything disconcerts them. Trembling with fear or brave to the point of heroism, they would go through fire and water, or fly from a shadow. They are ignorant of cause and effect, and of the connecting links between events. They are as promptly discouraged as they are exalted. They are subject to every description of panic. They are always either too highly strung or too downcast, but never in the mood or the measure the situation would require. More fluid than water, they reflect every line and assume every shape. What sort of a foundation for a government can they be expected to supply? Fortunately, all the characteristics just described as to be met within parliamentary assemblies are in no wise constantly displayed. Such assemblies only constitute crowds at certain moments. The individuals composing them retain their individuality in a great number of cases, which explains how it is that an assembly is able to turn out excellent technical laws. It is true that the author of these laws is a specialist who has prepared them in the quiet of his study, and that in reality the law voted is the work of an individual and not of an assembly. These laws are naturally the best. They are only liable to have disastrous results when a series of amendments has converted them into the outcome of a collective effort. The work of a crowd is always inferior, whatever its nature, to that of an isolated individual. It is specialists who safeguard assemblies from passing ill-advised or unworkable measures. The specialist in this case is a temporary leader of crowds. The assembly is without influence on him, but he has influence over the assembly. In spite of all the difficulties attending their working, parliamentary assemblies are the best form of government mankind has discovered as yet, and more especially the best means it has found to escape the yoke of personal tyrannies. They constitute assuredly the ideal government at any rate for philosophers, thinkers, writers, artists, and learned men, in a word, for all those who form the cream of a civilization. Moreover, in reality they only present two serious dangers, one being inevitable financial waste, and the other the progressive restriction of the liberty of the individual. The first of these dangers is necessary consequence of the exigencies and want of foresight of electoral crowds. Should a member of an assembly propose a measure giving apparent satisfaction to democratic ideas, should he bring in a bill, for instance, to assure old age pensions to all workers and to increase the wages of any class of state employees, the other deputies, victims of suggestion in their dread of their electors, would not venture to seem to disregard the interest of the latter by rejecting the proposed measure, although well aware they are imposing a fresh strain on the budget and necessitating the creation of new taxes. It is impossible for them to hesitate to give their votes. The consequences of the increase of expenditure are remote and will not entail disagreeable consequences for them personally, while the consequences of a negative vote might clearly come to light when they next present themselves for re-election. In addition to this first cause of an exaggerated expenditure, there is another not less imperative, the necessity of voting all grants for local purposes. A deputy is unable to oppose grants of this kind because they represent once more the exigencies of the electors, and because each individual deputy can only obtain what he requires for his own constituency on the condition of acceding to similar demands on the part of his colleagues. The second of the dangers referred to above, the inevitable restrictions on liberty consummated by parliamentary assemblies, is apparently less obvious, but is, nevertheless, very real. It is the result of the innumerable laws having always a restrictive action, which parliaments consider themselves obliged to vote, and to whose consequences, owing to their short-sightedness, they are in a great measure blind. The danger must indeed be most inevitable, since even England itself, which assuredly offers the most popular type of the parliamentary regime, the type in which the representative is most independent of his elector, having been unable to escape it. Herbert Spencer has shown, in a work already old, that the increase of apparent liberty must needs be followed by the decrease of real liberty. Returning to this contention in his recent book, The Individual versus the State, he thus expresses himself with regard to the English Parliament. Legislation since this period has followed the course I pointed out. Rapidly multiplying dictatorial measures have continually tended to restrict individual liberties, and this in two ways. Regulations have been established every year in greater number, imposing a constraint on the citizen in matters in which his acts were formerly completely free, and forcing him to accomplish acts which he was formerly at liberty to accomplish or not to accomplish at will. At the same time, heavier and heavier public, and especially local burdens, have still further restricted his liberty by diminishing the portion of his profits he can spend as he chooses, and by augmenting the portion which is taken from him to be spent according to the good pleasure of the public authorities. This progressive restriction of liberties shows itself in every country in a special shape, which Herbert Spencer has not pointed out. It is that the passing of these innumerable series of legislative measures, all of them in a general way of a restrictive order, conduces necessarily to augment the number, the power, and the influence of the functionaries charged with their application. These functionaries tend in this way to become the veritable masters of civilized countries. Their power is all the greater owing to the fact that amidst the incessant transfer of authority, the administrative caste is alone in being untouched by these changes, and alone possessing irresponsibility, impersonality, and perpetuity. There is no more oppressive despotism than that which presents itself under this triple form. This incessant creation of restrictive laws and regulations surrounding the pettiest actions of existence, with the most complicated formalities, inevitably has for its result the confining within narrower and narrower limits of the sphere in which the citizen may move freely. Victims of the delusion that equality and liberty are the better assured by the multiplication of laws, nations daily consent to put up with trammels increasingly burdensome. They do not accept this legislation with impunity. Accustomed to put up with every yoke, they soon end by desiring servitude, and lose all spontaneousness and energy. They are then no more than vain shadows, passive, unresisting, and powerless automata. Arrived at this point, the individual is bound to seek outside himself the forces he no longer finds within him. The functions of governments necessarily increase in proportion as the indifference and helplessness of the citizens grow. They it is who must necessarily exhibit the initiative, enterprising, and guiding spirit in which private persons are lacking. It falls on them to undertake everything, direct everything, and take everything under their protection. The state becomes an all-powerful God. Still, experience shows that the power of such gods was never either very durable or very strong. This progressive restriction of all liberties in the case of certain peoples, in spite of an outward license that gives them the illusion that these liberties are still in their possession, seems at least as much a consequence of their old age as of any particular system. It constitutes one of the precursory symptoms of that decadent phase which up to now no civilization has escaped. Judging by the lessons of the past and by the symptoms that strike the attention on every side, several of our modern civilizations have reached that phase of extreme old age which precedes decadence. It seems inevitable that all peoples should pass through identical phases of existence, since history is so often repeating its course. It is easy to note briefly these common phases of the evolution of civilizations, and I shall terminate this work with a summary of them. This rapid sketch will perhaps throw some gleams of light on the causes of the power at present wielded by crowds. If we examine in their main lines the genesis of the greatness and the fall of the civilization that preceded our own, what do we see? At the dawn of civilization, a swarm of men of various origin, brought together by the chances of migrations, invasions, and conquests, of different blood, and of equally different languages and beliefs. The only common bond of union between these men is the half-recognized law of a chief. The psychological characteristics of crowds are present in an eminent degree in these confused agglomerations. They have the transient cohesion of crowds, their heroism, their weakness, their impulsiveness, and their violence. Nothing is stable in connection with them. They are barbarians. At length, time accomplishes its work. The identity of surroundings, the repeated intermingling of races, the necessity of life in common exert their influence. The assemblage of dissimilar units begins to blend into a whole, to form a race that is an aggregate possessing common characteristics and sentiments to which heredity will give greater and greater fixity. The crowd has become a people, and this people is able to emerge from its barbarous state. However, it would only entirely emerge therefrom when, after long efforts, struggles necessarily repeated, and innumerable recommencements, it shall acquire an ideal. The nature of this ideal is of slight importance, whether it be the cult of Rome, the might of Athens, or the triumph of Allah. It will suffice to endow all the individuals of the race that is forming with perfect unity of sentiment and thought. At this stage, a new civilization, with its institutions, its beliefs, and its arts, may be born. In pursuit of its ideal, the race will acquire in succession the qualities necessary to give it splendor, vigor, and grandeur. At times, no doubt, it will still be a crowd, but henceforth, beneath the mobile and changing characteristics of crowds, is found a solid substratum, the genius of the race, which confines within narrow limits the transformations of a nation and overrules the play of chance. After having exerted its creative action, time begins that work of destruction, from which neither gods nor men escape. having reached a certain level of strength and complexity of civilization, ceases to grow, and having ceased to grow, it is condemned to a speedy decline. The hour of its old age has struck. This inevitable hour is always marked by the weakening of the ideal that was the mainstay of the race. In proportion as this ideal pales, all the religious, political, and social structures inspired by it begin to be shaken. With the progressive perishing of its ideal, the race loses more and more the qualities that lent it its cohesion, its unity, and its strength. The personality and intelligence of the individual may increase, but at the same time, this collective egoism of the race is replaced by an excessive development of the egoism of the individual, accompanied by a weakening of character and a lessening of the capacity for action. What constituted a people, a unity, a whole, becomes in the end an agglomeration of individualities lacking cohesion and artificially held together for a time by its traditions and institutions. It is at this stage that men, divided by their interests and aspirations, and incapable any longer of self-government, require directing in their pettiest acts, and that the state exerts an absorbing influence. With the definite loss of its old ideal, the genius of the race entirely disappears. It is a mere swarm of isolated individuals and returns to its original state, that of a crowd. Without consistency and without a future, it has all the transitory characteristics of crowds. Its civilization is now without stability and at the mercy of every chance. The populace is sovereign, and the tide of barbarism mounts. The civilization may still seem brilliant because it possesses an outward front, the work of a long past, but it is in reality an edifice crumbling to ruin, which nothing supports, and destined to fall in at the first storm. To pass in pursuit of an ideal from the barbarous to the civilized state, and then, when this ideal has lost its virtue, to decline and die. Such is the cycle of the life of a people. End of Book 3. End of The Crowd, a study of the popular mind by Gustave Le Bon.